Shalom, Chavarim, James Trim here, and we're going to be continuing the study on understanding Yeshua's Halacha, understanding the Halachot of Yeshua. Last study, we covered primarily Halacha concerning the Shabbat, but expanding it out to other topics as well. And the whole point of this process is not just to identify some of the halachot of Yeshua, that's easy enough, but to understand the halachot of Yeshua, understand the principles behind the halachot of Yeshua, the principles then that reveal how Yeshua's halachot were derived, and therefore will help us as the restoration of Nazarene Judaism in developing appropriate halachot in light of the teachings of Yeshua, and not just on topics that he addressed specifically, but to learn from Yeshua the process by which he derived halachot, and then apply them ourselves to other situations. So before I continue, I want to pause briefly and encourage you to please donate to support this ongoing work in the restoration. We've been I do this full time. And for those that don't know, my wife is disabled and chronically ill, and suffers from chronic pain. And so I stay here at home with her full time, and I'm her caretaker, and I work typically do most of my work at a desk about 6 feet away from her bed. So just to let you know about those factors. So that's why, other than the calling itself, is why I do this full time and have very little choice so if you would please donate to support this work, we would appreciate it. It helps make it possible. It's not just all me, it's a cooperative effort between all of us, as I well recognize. And so please do your part by chipping in, stepping up to the plate, and supporting the work. And you do that by sending a donation to donations@wnae.org. Donations@wnae.org. We literally have bills coming through this week, including the car payment, that we don't have money for. So hopefully you guys will step up to the plate and donate, and we'll be able to keep those bills from bouncing. And well, you know what happens when bouncing bills start creating a cascade of fees, and then it's difficult to return from that. All right, so let's get to our study today. And the case study we're going to look at today is Yeshua's halacha on the issue of divorce, which turns out also to lay out his halacha on the issue of another really hot topic, polygamy. Okay, so let's start with Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4 in the Torah. And if you're watching this on YouTube, not on Nazarene Space, if you go to nazarenespace.com/blog and you search for this video, Halacha of Yeshua 2, if you search for this video, if you go there soon enough, you may find that this is actually the featured item. We'll probably also add it to the videos section soon. Then you can see that there's a little hot link you can click on below that says handouts. And that hot link will give you a PDF file that you can either look at online or print out for yourself of helpful handouts for the study that we're doing. That's my style. That's the way I do this, like a class I was teaching in person. and having handouts for the students. Um, so you have the handouts right there for you. All right, so Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. When a man takes a wife and marries her, then it comes to pass, if she find no favor in his eyes, because he has found some unseemly thing in her, that he writes her a bill of divorcement and gives it in her hand and sends her out of his house. And she departs out of his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And the latter husband hates her and writes her a bill of divorcement and gives it in her hand and sends her out of his home. Or if the latter husband die, he took her to be his wife. Her former husband, who sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. After that she is defiled, for that is abomination before Yahweh, and you shall not cause the land to sin, which Yahweh your Elohim gives you for an inheritance. First 4 verses there of Devarim. Now, a couple of important factors here as before we move forward is that you'll notice that this really isn't a mitzvah about divorce as such. It's actually a mitzvah about remarriage, against remarriage of a party that's been divorced, remarried somebody else, and then divorced again and wants to come back and remarry the original husband. And that is prohibited by Torah. So, since that's prohibited by Torah, Torah then matter-of-factly mentions in verse 1 that divorce happens. And that's why it opens up saying, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and then it comes to pass, if she find no favor in his eyes, and because he has found some unseemly thing in her, that he writes her a bill of divorcement and gives it to her hand and sends her out of his house. So it's important to notice here that the concept of divorce isn't Elohim's idea. He doesn't prescribe a method of divorce other than saying that if it happens and mentioning how it can happen within the, in other words, it happens, so he seeks to regulate it somewhat. Now let's look at the rabbinic, Pharisaic halachot concerning this particular mitzvah. This is covered in the Mishnah, in Mishnah Gittin 9, chapter 9, section 10. It says, the house of Shammai says, a man should divorce his wife only because he has found grounds for it in unchastity. Let me back up. That just brings up another important point. If we back up to Deuteronomy, the handout on Deuteronomy 24, we see that the phrase unseemly thing is in the Hebrew eravat davar, which is an ambiguity in the Hebrew. The word davar can mean thing or word, okay, and or something, thing or something, and this word can mean idiomatically. It can mean sexual immorality. It's a matter of nakedness, for example, literally. However, it can also just idiomatically mean a bad thing. Okay, so the house of, you may recall in our last video, we talked about how Yeshua's halachot normally fall with the house of Shammai. I'm sorry, the house of Hillel, as opposed to the house of Shammai. The house of Hillel was generally concerned with the spirit of the Torah. The house of Shammai was concerned more with the letter of the Torah. As in the Zohar it says, the house of Hillel was rooted in chesed, which is grace and loving kindness. And the halachot of Shammai, of the school of Shammai, was rooted in Gevarah, justice, judgment, severity. And so As a rule, Yeshua tends to go more to the Hillel side of things on most issues and in general, and we covered that sort of thing in our last study, an example, and and demonstrated that the Pharisaic halacha concerning Shabbat of the house of Hillel was very similar to that of Yeshua relative to, say, the Essenes, okay, who were even stricter than the house of Shammai. So the house of Shammai says, and this is interesting because Yeshua here agrees with the house of Shammai against Hillel. The house of Shammai says a man should divorce his wife only because he has found grounds for it in unchastity. And interestingly, here what it does for the word chastity is it flips the words and it uses devar arava. Since it has for unchastity, sexual immorality, in other words. Since it is said, because he has found in her an unclean matter, and then there it's aravot, devar, in anything, Deuteronomy 24:1. So that's the house of Shammai's position. The house of Shammai says the only reason that's valid in Torah for a man to divorce his wife is a matter of unchastity, and the reason for that is that the literal meaning of Deuteronomy 24:1 is a matter of nakedness, if you will. The house of Hillel says even if she spoils his dish, she doesn't make his food right, he doesn't like her kitchen work, since it is said, because he has found in her a unclean matter in anything, and he stresses the word anything and then understands the unclean matter to be the idiomatic bad thing. And then Rabbi Akiba, he comes along, and Rabbi Akiba is of the school of Hillel, by the way, and expands Hillel's point of view further, takes it a step further. Excuse me. Rabbi Akiba takes it a step further. He says, even if he found someone else prettier than she, since it is said, and it shall be if she find no favor in his eyes, emphasizing the phrase favor in his eyes. So reading it the different ways, just the first verse here going back, Hillel reads it, when a man takes a wife and marries her, then it comes to pass, if she find no favor in his eyes, because he has found some, this is Shammai, I'm sorry. Shammai reads it, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and then it comes to pass, if she find no favor in his eyes, because he has found some unseemly thing, some matter of nakedness in her, that he writes her a bill of divorcement and gives it in her hand and sends her out of his house. But Hillel reads it, when a man takes a wife and marries her, then it comes to pass, if she find no favor in his eyes, because he has found some unseemly thing in her, in anything. In other words, he stresses that devar to be a thing or anything. That he writes her a bill of divorcement and gives it in her hand and sends her out of his house. So Shammai stresses aravat, and Hillel stresses devar. And then Akiba comes along and stresses something else entirely. He says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, then it comes to pass, if she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some unseemly thing in her, then he writes her a bill of divorcement and gives it into her hand and sends her out of his house. So the rabbinic halacha is that a man can divorce his wife for anything as simple as she spoiled his dish, she burnt dinner, or even if he finds a prettier girl. That's the rabbinic halachot that's come down from Pharisaic Judaism from the school of Hillel. Now, I have included for you here in the handout the Gemara to this Mishnah, and it's found in the Babylonian Talmud in Gittin 90A through 90B. We're not going to go over it because we already have, or you can, if you go back through my videos on YouTube and you find the video titled uh, Introduction to the Talmud, I believe it is, Lesson 3, I believe it is, which is an in-depth study of this Mishnah and Gemara. So I encourage you to go study this out further in the Gemara and a nice deep Talmud study. But we have covered sufficient to deal with the Second Temple era issues that are dealt with in the Mishnah, and to really get a basic idea. And for baseline comparison to the Essenes and to Yeshua. So now we get to the Essene Halacha of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the Damascus document, column 4, line 20 through column 5, line 2, I believe, in the Damascus document, we read, they, and contextually it's talking about the Pharisees here, they are caught in fornication by taking 2 wives in their lifetime, although the principle of creation, Yesod Habrian Hebrew, is male and female. He created them. Genesis 1:27. And those who entered the ark went into the ark 2 by 2. Genesis 7:9. Concerning the leaders, it is written, he shall not multiply wives to himself. Deuteronomy 17:17. Okay. So the Essenes see this idea of flippant divorce for a woman just burning dinner, or if he finds a prettier girl. The Essenes saw this as backdoor polygamy. And because he is married to, he's taking 2 wives in his lifetime. And they see it as violating the halacha that they already have in place against polygamy. So they base this on Genesis 1:27, Genesis 7:9, and Deuteronomy 17:17. In terms of the rules of Hillel, the hermeneutic rules of Hillel, this would be an instance of building a rule from 2 or more passages. But they come to the conclusion of building this rule against polygamy. And of course, polygamy is not outright prohibited in the Torah. Divorce is not outright prohibited in the Torah. In both cases, the Torah recognizes that it happens. Okay, but the question we have here now is our halacha concerning it. And the Essene halacha was, and by the way, the Pharisees by this time weren't really doing well. The Essene halacha was that the divorce for no reason at all, or for such simple reasons as finding a prettier girl or your wife burning your dinner, was a violation of the principles of Torah, that he created the male and female, and that they went into the ark 2 by 2. Yeshua does a little bit better job of explaining this, as we'll see in a minute, and also the rule that prohibits leaders from practicing polygamy. By the way, the Damascus document generalizes this to leaders, but of course in Deuteronomy 17:17 it's actually kings. But they generalize it to rulers. Okay, now let's look at Yeshua's halakha on this subject. And we'll see how similar it is to the Essene Halacha on this subject, and to supporting the position of Shammai. But we're also going to want to understand the reason. Now, interestingly enough, this Halacha, I've laid it out in Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 9, is actually laid out as a halakhic midrash. And I'm not going to go into that right now. I do in my commentaries and laying out the different forms of standard forms of midrash and midrashic exegesis. But Yeshua is engaging in one of the standard forms of midrashic exegesis here in these passages. And so the verse 3, the Parashim, or the Pharisees, approached him and tempted him, or tested him, saying, is it right for a man to put away his wife for any cause? And that's a Hillel position. And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made man in the beginning made them male and female? So this is exactly here like the Damascus document. And said, wherefore shall a man leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Genesis 2:24. That's an additional passage as he added. It wasn't actually in the Damascus document, although it certainly could have fit there very well. Verse 6, and now then they are no more two, but one flesh only. What therefore Elohim is joined together, man cannot separate. Okay, so he lays out this concept here. Verse 7, and they said, why then did Moshe then command to give a bill of divorcement and to put her away if she was not pleasing in his sight? Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 and 3. And he answered and said to them, because Moshe, on account of the hardness of your hearts, allowed you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I tell you, every man that is put away or shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and takes another, commits adultery. And whoever takes the divorced also commits adultery. So here he's agreeing with the position of Shammai. He is also agreeing with the reasoning of the Essenes in the Damascus document, which is very important because the Essenes say that their reason is because of the principle of creation, or in Hebrew, the Yesod HaBriah. The principle of creation, or the Yesod HaBriah. And this is parallel to Yeshua's statement, but from the beginning it was not so. From the beginning, or Yesod HaBriah, or the principle of creation. So Yeshua's reasoning in this halachot, in which he agrees with the school of Shammai and with the Essenes against the school of Hillel in this instance, which is important for us to really analyze this, because if Yeshua is agreeing with Shammai and the Essenes against the school of Hillel, when his general rule is chesed, 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 as opposed to gevarah, and that the Torah was committed to man and not vice versa. But here he has a position that's opposed to Hillel and agreeing with Shammai and agreeing with the Essenes, and he's doing so because of the phrase he uses, from the beginning it was not so. And this is agreeing with or applying the principle of creation, the Yesod HaBriah. So the Essenes and Yeshua are basically saying that the Torah doesn't outright prohibit this, but it goes against the Yesod HaBriah, the principle of creation. It was not so in the beginning. Bereshit, at the beginning, wasn't so. Actually, the Hebrew is Marashit in Matthew 19:8. Okay, So now that we understand or see this principle being used as a halachic principle by Yeshua, it's interesting to look at what Philo of Alexandria says about this principle. This principle is similar, essentially identical to what the Hellenistic Jews, who were essentially Stoics, um, their philosophy. Um, so it's interesting that the Essenes and Philo agreed on this, and that Yeshua was agreeing. Um, so, quoting Philo of Alexandria in his book on creation, he opens the book early on by saying, and his, Moshe's exordium, talking about the opening chapters of Genesis, as I have already said, is most admirable, embracing the creation of the world under the idea that the Torah corresponds to the world and the world to the Torah, and that a man who is obedient to the Torah, being by so doing a citizen of the world, arranges his actions with reference to the intention of creation. That would be the Yesod HaBriah, the principle of creation, in harmony with which the whole universal world is regulated. And then towards the end of that same document on creation, in his wrap-up, he says, starting in section 143, but since every city in which laws are properly established has a regular constitution, it became necessary for the citizen of the world to adopt the same constitution as that which prevailed in the universal world. And this constitution is the right reason of nature, which in more appropriate language is denominated Torah or law, being a divine arrangement in accordance with which every suitable and appropriate is assigned to every individual. But of this city and constitution there must have been some citizens before man, who might be justly called citizens of a mighty city, having received the greatest imaginable circumference to dwell in, and having been enrolled in the largest and most perfect commonwealth. And then in his book on the life of Moses, book 2, section 48, Philo of Alexandria writes, for he, speaking of Moses, was not like any ordinary compiler of history, studying to leave behind him records of ancient transactions as memorials to future ages, for the mere sake of affording pleasure without any advantage. But he traced back the most ancient events from the beginning. Well, that's the same phrase Yeshua used, from the beginning of the world, commencing with the creation of the universe, in order to make known two most necessary principles. First, that the same being was Father and Creator of the world, and likewise the lawgiver of truth. Secondly, that the man who adhered to these laws and clung closely to a connection with the obedience to nature, i.e. the principle of creation, the Yesod HaBriah, would live in a manner corresponding to the arrangement of the universe, with a perfect harmony and union between his words and his actions, and between his actions and his words. And this, by the way, is what Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 1. Okay, all of this all fits together with Yeshua's precepts of Halacha. So Yeshua's got a principle of Halacha that we can learn here from Yeshua's application and of Halacha, and his Halacha concerning this issue that's very important. It's very important to understand, because here's a unique situation where Yeshua is agreeing with Shammai against Hillel, and he's doing so on the basis of the principle of Yesod HaBriah, the foundation or principle of creation, or what Philo called natural law. So Yeshua in the final analysis, then also weights his halacha on what is in keeping with the principle of creation or the foundation of creation. What was the intent of the Creator? And that's an important principle for Yeshua's halacha. So one that can override chesed, because we see that Yeshua usually sides with Hillel, and we can see how if you're giving grace at least to the man, chesed to the man, leniency to the man, that he could divorce his wife for anything. Maybe not so much for the woman, but for the man. But here we withhold the chesed and we apply gevarah, severity, justice, judgment, because in this case the Yesod HaBriyah takes precedence. So now we've learned yet another principle of Yeshua's halachot. In our last study, we learned the principle that of under grace, under chesed, that chesed outweighs. We learned first of all the principle of weight of halachot. Some halachot outweigh others. So if you have to choose between one or the other, that the weightier halacha, the weightier mitzvah, is the one that you keep, and the less weighty one is loosed, so that you can keep the weightier one. And so we learned that chesed outweighs all of them. Loving kindness, acts of loving kindness, outweigh all of the mitzvot. And we also learned that likewise, well, they don't outweigh all of the mitzvot, but chesed, or loving kindness, outweighs the Sabbath, outweighs the sacrifices and offerings. Go back and watch the last study if you don't understand this, and outweighs therefore everything, since the Sabbath, violating the Sabbath had the penalty of death, everything with a penalty less than death, say the kosher laws. And likewise, the same thing can be said for the knowledge of Elohim, making known the knowledge of Elohim, spreading the knowledge of Elohim, revealing the knowledge of Elohim, teaching the knowledge of Elohim, outweighs, learning the knowledge of Elohim also, outweighs the Sabbath, sacrifices and offerings first of all, and the Sabbath, therefore, because the sacrifices and offerings are done on the Sabbath, and then outweighs the anything with a penalty other than death, or less than death. And all of these are, all this we covered in our last study. And then the principle in our last study that the Torah was created for man and man wasn't created for the Torah. So the Torah is for our benefit. We're not for the benefit of the Torah. We don't serve the Torah serves us. So those two principles we learned, or three principles: the principle of weight, the principle of being under chesed rather than under the law, and the principle that the Torah was made for the benefit of man, and man wasn't made for the benefit of the Torah. Those are three principles of Yeshua's halachot that we learned last week, or yesterday actually, or in our most recent study. And in this study, we've learned yet another principle, and that principle is Yesod HaBriyah, the principle of creation. That in making a halachic choice, the one that favors the principle of creation, because the Torah should be applied, therefore, in a manner in which is in keeping with the intent of the Creator. So, in keeping with the intent of the Creator, that man is that the Torah was created for man and for the benefit of man, not vice versa, and that chesed, loving kindness, and the knowledge of Elohim both outweigh the sacrifices and offerings, and therefore the Sabbath and anything with a penalty uh, short of death. They may outweigh a lot of other things, by the way. Those are things yet to be explored, but certainly at least the Sabbath. We know because that if something has a penalty less than death, that it's of lower weight than the Sabbath. But really, anything of lesser weight than the Sabbath or anything of lesser weight than the sacrifices and offerings is outweighed by Chesed and by um, the knowledge of Elohim. So now we have four principles. And with these four principles, it's very helpful and useful for us to be able to analyze the body of halachot that has come down to us in light of these four principles to derive from that process an adequate and useful Nazarene halacha as the restoration of Nazarene Judaism moves forward in these last days. And one more time, I'm going to close by asking you to please financially support this work. Um, and one of the reasons I'm emphasizing this so much right now is we have bills facing us this week that we don't have the money for and are supposed to clear our account tomorrow night, starting tomorrow night. In addition, I got an email last week from one of our leading supporters. In fact, our leading supporter, our leading supporter, having difficulty with his business, going to have to cut down his giving and substantially, and we have been barely making it as it is. So we really need many of you to step up to the plate and donate and help support this work. And hopefully some of you that haven't been donating at all can step up and start donating a little bit, $20 or $30. And some of you who any donation helps, and any donation is better than no donation. And if you can donate more, we definitely need more, because we are struggling as it is and just lost a major, um, well, we didn't lose it, but it was drastically decreased for the foreseeable future. All right, so the restoration of Nazarene Judaism continues, and it is my function in this movement and in this restoration to apply the talents and studies that I have accumulated over the last 40 years in Halacha, in Kabbalah, in history, and all the Hebrew and Aramaic origins of the so-called New Testament books to help us restore and understand the teachings of Yeshua and the ancient sect of the Nazarenes. So I hope you benefit from this and this work, and shalom for now. We'll see you soon.